Hello, and welcome back to our 10th lecture now in Pagans and Christians. Last time, we examined the place of Christianity in the Roman Empire before and after the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. We saw how before Constantine, during the persecutions of the Tetrarchs, Christianity had been made into an illegal religion, one that was persecuted very viciously at that time. And of course, it had been persecuted throughout the entire span of its existence, the first 3 centuries of the Christian era, although the persecutions varied in scope and intensity over that time, definitely becoming more vehement in the middle of the 3rd century and onwards. And we saw how Constantine's conversion to Christianity changed the religious situation in the empire dramatically and relatively quickly. It is worth keeping in mind, then, as I have mentioned throughout this course, that neighboring kingdoms, such as the Persian Empire, never had a ruler convert to Christianity, and therefore Christianity never became the religion of the majority of those other empires' inhabitants. And I mention this because it underscores just how special the conversion of the West to Christianity was, and how on purely human terms, it was not at all inevitable. Constantine actively supported Christianity throughout his reign through financial support behind the church. He empowered Christian bishops and gave them a judicial role in the empire. He may have shut down some pagan temples. Certainly, he did not outlaw paganism and pagan sacrifice within the empire, but he did withdraw imperial largesse, that is, monies given for the festivals and so on, and for the maintenance of these temples. He certainly outlawed crucifixion, and also he didn't outlaw the gladiator games, but he did withdraw public financing from them. And he passed laws both allowing bishops to manumit slaves in church and also forbidding parents from selling their children into slavery. I'm sorry. He because of the consideration of considering it the lesser evil compared to exposure or infanticide, that idea of selling one's children into slavery was something that he allowed to continue so as to discourage infanticide or exposure of children. All of his successors but one followed and expanded his policies, and as a result, during the course of the 4th century, pagans flooded into the Christian church, seeing that now Christianity was gaining the upper hand, so much so that by the year 400, there were certainly still pagans, many pagans indeed, within the Roman Empire. And out in the countryside, there were large areas that Christianity had not yet touched because they were so inaccessible. And one could still definitely find diehard senators and philosophers who did not like the newfangled ways of Christianity. But nevertheless, the numbers of all of these groups that I've just enumerated were beginning to dwindle. And certainly Christianity was becoming much more populous. However, the 4th century was really the battleground period in the struggle between Christianity and paganism. In particular, there was one last emperor by the name of Julian, who attempted to stop the spread of Christianity and to revive paganism. Even though he only reigned for about 2 years and died while in his early 30s, 31 to be precise, he definitely was a very important figure and remarkable in many ways. And today, we're going to examine Julian the Apostate, as he was known, and we will see that his reign really is a reminder of the fact that the conversion of Europe to Christianity was, as I already have said again, by no means inevitable from the point of view of historical contingency, as a result of the Constantinian revolution, or even by the efforts of his sons that followed him, ruling from 337 to 361. Constantine died in the year 337, And his first successors in both the eastern and western half of the empire were his sons Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius. I'm terribly sorry about the, the similarity of those names. Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius. Now, his successors largely continued and even expanded his policies of lending support to Christianity and of punishing paganism. If Constantine had not explicitly outlawed pagan sacrifice, well, his successors, his sons, certainly did by the end of the 340s. And one of the most striking symbolic moments in the shift from paganism to Christianity came in the year 357, because in that year there was an altar in the Roman Senate, the actual Senate house, known as the Altar of Victory. This altar had been placed there by Augustus himself, the first emperor. It had been put there in the wake of the Battle of Actium. That was basically the battle in 31 BC that saw Augustus sort of emerge supreme from the catastrophic civil wars that so characterized the late Republic, and where Mark Antony and Cleopatra were defeated by Augustus, really Augustus's right-hand man, Marcus Agrippa. And nevertheless, to celebrate this event and kind of becoming the first emperor of Rome in all but name, the Emperor Augustus placed this altar of victory inside of the Senate house. And the Senate house, well, the Senate in general, was the strongest bastion of paganism that really there was left in the Roman Empire. The senators were very strongly committed to polytheism, and therefore, is really to make a statement. In the year 357, the Emperor Constantius, one of the sons of Constantine, had the altar of victory yanked out of the Roman Senate house and put into deep storage, we would say, despite the protests of the Roman senators and the fact that a Christian emperor, at the fact, we might say, that a Christian emperor would have dared to go into the Roman Senate house and take out this venerable old altar, and that they really saw as a sign, and we should see it as a sign of how Christianity was growing in strength rapidly. Julian the Apostate, on the other hand, who ruled from 361 to 363, he was altogether different. He was the last pagan emperor. He would not have called himself the apostate. Christian authors refer to him as the apostate. The term apostata in Latin is really just it's a Greek word apostatis, which simply means one who has stood away. And the idea, of course, is stood away from his religion. It means somebody who has abandoned their faith. He was raised as a Christian, that is, and he was actually a relative of Constantine. He was the nephew of Constantine. And he's, from a relatively early time in his life, even though he had been raised as a Christian and may have actually been groomed to become the Archbishop of Constantinople, nevertheless, he became a fervent devotee of paganism. And we will see that in the course of his very brief reign, he tried to win back much of the ground that paganism had lost to Christianity since the conversion of Constantine, his own uncle. Now, as I say, he seems to have become a pagan, although secretly when he was relatively young, perhaps as early as 351 AD. And he became a pagan under the influence of pagan teachers who brought him back to the old religion. And he decided it would not be a good thing to announce his paganism, though, and so he maintained his beliefs and rituals in secret until later in his life. And it's a point that's important to stress again, not only the importance of individuals in history as a principle of historical change, but also how easy it is for us with a sense of perspective to say that with Constantine, it became inevitable that Christianity was on the rise, and all the developments that I've discussed in the last lecture, that the conversion of the empire to Christianity was somehow inevitable. And we should just simply follow out the story and be done with it. Julian's existence and his reign, albeit a brief one, prove that it was by no means certain what the religious loyalties of the wider Roman world would ultimately be. What then makes Julian so controversial? Well, first of all, he's a figure that's quite unusual among the emperors of Rome. And not just in terms of his paganism, but simply from, we might even say to begin with, the fact that he was an intellectual. He was very schooled in philosophy and in literature, and was kind of in some ways very much at home in the library, in the stacks. Secondly, of course, his native language was not Latin, but was Greek. It was clear from his birth that he was trained in theology. He knew the New Testament scriptures, at least in an outward sense. And as I say, he was in some ways probably being groomed to become the Archbishop of Constantinople. But in addition to that, he has engendered all sorts of various interests, and we might even say interpretations, both by his detractors, that would be Christian authors writing in his lifetime, as well as his admirers, both past and present. Foremost among the latter, that is, among pagan admirers of his, is the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who lived in the 4th century AD. He was probably born either in the city of Beirut or Antioch, definitely in the east, so either way. He was of a Roman colonial family, and he's oftentimes referred to as the last great imperial historian of Rome. He wrote a narrative history in Latin in which Julian's career is the centerpiece. Ammianus Marcellinus is one of our major sources on the Emperor Julian. And remarkably, he has a very balanced view on Julian and Julian's policies, even though Julian was a fellow pagan, and in general, Ammianus Marcellinus is rather laudatory of him, is very much an admirer of him. He is not beyond, though, making criticisms of this emperor either. Other authors in recent times, and these admirers really do span almost the whole span of European history, but particularly since the French Enlightenment and the Romantic movement in literature. Other authors who have looked at Julian in a positive light are such as those as Gore Vidal, who in 1964 published a novel on Julian. Vidal's novel is largely anachronistic. Vidal is more interested really in dealing with the literary criticism, with literary criticism, and also advocating positions against religious intolerance. Nonetheless, it is a significant and interesting book, and it goes to show how controversial and indeed how important Julian still is to history, that he lives on in novels, he lives in philosophical works, in historical accounts. If you have read some of the poetry from the 19th century, the Romantic period is oftentimes looked at as this kind of romantic figure, this man against the world, doomed to fail, but still pouring his heart into his cause, that sort of thing. And it's definitely in the popular imagination, in the kind of pathetic and somewhat ludicrous neo-pagan movement that has come into existence in the last several decades. He is oftentimes looked at with great admiration by these poor lost souls. Anyone familiar, of course, with the world of late Rome knows who Julian is. He is probably one of the most famous figures from the late Roman world, right after Constantine himself. Well, Julian is also unique for us historically because he wrote an enormous amount of work, literature, in a very short amount of time as emperor, and a lot of it still exists. Essentially, he was only emperor, as I say, for about 2 years, but he wrote 9 major philosophical works together with hymns, letters, and administrative documents. His writings alone fill 3 volumes of the Loeb Classical Library. One of his most important works is a criticism of Christianity known as Against the Galileans. The Galileans, that is his word for Christians, which serves in part, which survives in part because it is a very very hostile criticism of Christian theology. And it was actually used by Christians in their education so as to hone their debating skills. Promising young clergymen and theological students in antiquity and onwards would use this text to build arguments and to refute the analysis of Julian against Christian doctrine and against the Christian New Testament texts. And the work actually survives largely because of Cyril of Alexandria, who wrote a refutation of Julian's against the Galileans, and he quotes very, very large sections of it. So rather similar to, say, Origen's work against Celsus. And so people have been able to kind of go through it and extract all of those texts. And you can buy a copy of it online, such as what you see right in front of you now. Well, Julian, as I said, is a perplexing figure. Some see him as a hero of a lost cause. Some see him in that way in a positive light. Some see him in that regard in a negative light. Those who think that Julian was just an anachronism, that he had no chance of reversing Constantine's revolution, often will dismiss Julian as a rather eccentric and overzealous pagan ruler. Others will see him as a man who had great vision, who could have out-Constantine Constantine. That is, he would have used had he reigned for 30 years, or even 20 years as opposed to 2, he would have used the patronage and the power of the imperial administration and army to restore the worship of the old gods, just in the same way that his uncle had upheld the new faith of Christianity. So what I'd like to do right now for the next hour or so is take a look at Julian himself. And we'll talk about his career in something of a diachronic format. We'll take a look at some of his reforms, some of his edicts that he issued, and then his death when he was out on Persian expedition in June of 363. Which marks, in my mind, a very important turning point in the religious history of the Roman world. And indeed, that is one of your final exam questions. If you were to make a kind of list of the major turning points in the history of the religious, if you were to come up with the kind of most decisive turning points of the in the religious history of the Roman world, what would they be? I think this would definitely have to be one of them. Well, let us begin then. The child, as William Wordsworth, speaking of 19th century Romantic poets, the child is father of the man. And since for the last 17 centuries, historians have been trying to explain Julian's curious and complex character in terms of his early life, it may be worthwhile to trace those formative years very briefly here. His father is the man you see in front of you, Julius Constantius. And he was the younger of 2 sons born to the emperor Constantius Chlorus, that is the father of Constantine, by his second wife Theodora, thereby he belonging to a branch of the imperial family that had been essentially obliged to keep an extremely low profile after the succession of Constantine and his elevation of Theodora's predecessor, Helena, Saint Helena, to Augustan rank. Julius Constantius had thus spent the greater part of his first 40-odd years of life in what was effectively a comfortable but unproductive exile, when, soon after Helena's death, Constantine had invited him with his second wife and his young family to take up residence in his new capital. And it was there in Constantinople that his third son, Julian, would be born. In May or June of the year 332, that is, Julian was born. The baby's mother, Basilina, a Greek from Asia Minor, died a few weeks later, and the little boy, together with his 2 considerably older stepbrothers and 1 stepsister, were brought up by a succession of nurses and tutors under his father's benevolent, if somewhat distant, supervision. Then, when Julian was only 5 years old, his father, Julius Constantius, was murdered, the first victim of a family bloodbath that followed the accession of the sons of St. Constantine to the throne, which we won't have to go into now. Basically, when his sons took over, they began kind of a purge of all the adult males who could in any way prove to be threatening to the new dynasty. And this was a day, of course, that Julian never forgot. Whether he actually witnessed the murder of his father and stepbrother is not recorded, nor do we know though we can easily guess how near he himself came to sharing their fate. No doubt he was something like the Emperor Claudius, kind of deemed too unimportant to be worth killing, and so he therefore survived. But the experience left a permanent scar, and although a child of his age could hardly have understood why it occurred or who was responsible, the truth ultimately would become apparent as he grew up. And as it did, his early respect for his cousin turned into an undying hatred. To Constantius, that is the cousin, on the other hand, young Julian was no more than a minor irritation. The only real problem was what to do with him. The emperor sent him first to Nicomedia, where Bishop Eusebius was his tutor, and he could be assured of a conscientious, if somewhat parochial, Christian upbringing. And then when Julian was 11, he and his brother Gallus found themselves effectively exiled to Macellum, the ancient palace of the kings of Cappadocia. There he remained for 6 years with only books for a company. Not until 349 were the two of them allowed to return to the capital. Gallus was called to the imperial court. Julian, however, by now formidably well read in both classical and Christian literature, obtained permission to apply himself to more serious study. And by all accounts, the next 6 years were the happiest in Julian's life, spent wandering across the Greek world from one philosophical school to another, sitting at the feet of the greatest thinkers, scholars, and rhetoricians of his day, reading, arguing, discussing, disputing. First, he was in Constantinople, and from there he returned to Nicomedia, but not to the old Eusebius, the bishop who had baptized him as a child. The name, rather, that attracted him now had firmly rejected Christianity, and that was of the rhetorician Libanius. He was a celebrated philosopher who, as I said, had firmly rejected Christianity and all it stood for, and remained a proud and self-confessed pagan. By this time, the direction of Julian's own sympathies may have been suspected, when one of his former Christian teachers forced him to swear a solemn oath that he would no longer attend Libanius's lectures. Julian had them simply taken down and copied at his own expense. After some time at Nicomedia, he passed on to Pergamum. You remember that great cultural center in the northwest of Turkey, and thence to Ephesus, further south, and finally to Athens. And it seems to have been while he was at Ephesus that he made his decision to formally renounce Christianity forever, and to transfer his allegiance to the pagan gods of antiquity. But the process was a gradual one, to which it is impossible to ascribe a precise date. In any case, he had no choice. In his exposed position, he had no choice but to keep his new faith a secret. And it was to be another 10 years before he was able to avow it openly. Now, Julian arrived in his tour of all these major cultural centers of the Eastern Empire. He arrived at Athens in the year 355 in the early summer. He had not been in Athens long before he caught the eye of a fellow student. It seemed to me, wrote St. Gregory the theologian later, that there was no evidence of a sound character in that oddly disjointed neck, those hunched and twitching shoulders, that wild darting eye, that swaying walk, that haughty way of breathing down that prominent nose, those ridiculous facial expressions, that nervous and uncontrolled laughter, that ever nodding head, and that halting speech. Now, as one of the empire's and indeed the church's leading theologians, St. Gregory was admittedly biased against this young neo-pagan. The portrait he paints is hardly an attractive one, and yet despite its exaggerations, it still somehow has an authentic ring, and it is at least partly corroborated by other descriptions that have come down to us, all acknowledging that Julian was obviously not a handsome man. Burly and stocky, he did indeed hold his head at a curious angle. He had fine, dark eyes under straight brows, but their effect was spoiled by the overlarge mouth and sagging lip that he had. In manner, not surprisingly, in one who had grown up essentially without a single friend of his own age, he was awkward, uncertain, and quite painfully shy. Not the sort of material, in short, of which emperors were made. But then he had no ambitions in that regard either. He asked no more than to be allowed to remain in Athens with his teachers and his books. And when the call came to present himself before Constantius at Milan, Julian himself tells us how he prayed to Athena to bring him death rather than allow him to set forth on so fateful a journey. But his prayers went unanswered. The emperor's command could not be disobeyed. And therefore, on Julian's arrival at Milan, the situation proved to be just as he had feared. After an agonizing wait of several days, he was duly received by Constantius. The two of them had only met once before, some 7 or 8 years previously at Macellum. And Constantius informed Julian that he was henceforth a Caesar, that is, kind of a junior emperor. His hair was trimmed short, his scholar's beard shaved, his ungainly body squeezed into a tight-fitting military uniform, and on November 6th, he received his formal acclamation from the assembled troops. As he acknowledged their doubtless somewhat perfunctory cheers, he and they could hardly have failed to remember the unfortunate Gallus, acclaimed in similar fashion not 5 years before, and already 12 months in his grave. This is, of course, Julian's brother. The emperor's words as he presented the new Caesar to the legions were nothing if not affectionate. But Julian knew that if he were to avoid the fate of his half-brother Gallus, he would have to tread warily indeed. And the interminable panegyric which he composed at this time, and which we still possess, in praise of Constantius, leaves us in no doubt that he intended to do so. Now, there has been a long tradition, initiated in fact by Julian himself, to the effect that when he was sent after this acclamation into Gaul as Caesar in the late autumn of 355, it was as little more than a figurehead, that, as Libanius put it later in his funeral oration of Julian, quote, Julian had authority to do nothing save to wear the uniform, end quote. There were even suggestions that he was being deliberately sent by Constantius to almost certain death. All this was, of course, nonsense. The emperor could boast a formidable record of family murders already, and had he seriously wished to eliminate Julian, who was a wandering scholar, had presented no conceivable threat to his own security, he would have found a far quicker and surer way of doing it. And he would hardly have given Julian the hand of his sister Helena in marriage, as he also did at this time. Besides, the need for a Caesar in the West was genuine and undeniable. The truth seems to be that Julian, on assuming what he had expected to be the unfettered command of the army in Gaul, was piqued to discover that both the praetorian prefect and the magister equitum, that is, the civil and military commanders, respectively, were directly responsible not to Julian, but to Constantius himself. Here, Julian believed, was a deliberate attempt on the part of the emperor to diminish his new authority. The thought that he was not yet even 24 and totally without experience in the field does not seem to have struck him. But remarkably, he learned fast. It was he, rather than his cautious generals, who led the whirlwind campaign in the summer of 356 that took his army from Vienne to Autun, to Troyes, to Reims, and thence to Mainz, through Vosges to Koblenz, and finally to Cologne. These eastern cities, all right along the Rhine River in Germania. All of these places had been taken over by the Franks 10 months before, and now Julian recaptured them all for the empire in a whirlwind campaign. The following year saw a still greater triumph near Strasbourg, in which 13,000 legionaries smashed a Frankish enemy of 30,000 or more, leaving some 6,000 dead on the field at a cost of just 247 of their own Romans. The next 2 years brought still further victories, such that by the end of the decade, the imperial rule in Gaul had been reestablished for the whole length of the frontier, and now Julian himself was settled in Paris and was in undisputed control of the region. In the east, unfortunately, to which Constantius, after a brief visit to Rome, had long since returned, the situation was a good deal less happy. In 359, the emperor Constantius had received a letter from the Persian king saying, "Shapur, king of kings, brother of the sun and moon, sends salutation. Your own authors are witness that the entire territory within the river Strymon and the borders of Macedon was once held by my forefathers. Were I to require you to restore all this, it would not ill become me. But because I take delight in moderation, I shall be content to receive Mesopotamia and Armenia, which was fraudulently extorted from my grandfather. I give you warning that if my ambassador returns empty-handed, I shall take the field against you with all my armies as soon as the winter is past." Constantius had no intention of surrendering any of the disputed territory to King Shapur. He was, however, fully aware that he now faced the greatest challenge of his reign, and in January of 360, he sent a tribune to Paris demanding huge reinforcements from Julian for his army in the east. In particular, he demanded 4 auxiliary units formed of members of Gallic or Frankish tribes loyal to the empire, and he ordered that they were to leave at once for Mesopotamia, while all other units were to make available 300 men each. By Caesar and soldiery alike, the imperial command was received with horror. Julian was faced with the prospect of losing at a single stroke well over half his army. He had, moreover, promised the Gallic detachments that they would never be sent to the east. They, for their part, knew that if they allowed themselves to be marched away, they would be unlikely ever again to see their wives and families. These would be left destitute behind them, an easy prey for the barbarian bands who, finding the frontier almost unguarded, would once again come swarming into imperial territory. We shall never know for certain just what took place then in Paris during those fateful spring days. According to Julian's own account in a letter which he wrote to the people of Athens late in the following year, he was determined that the emperor's orders should be obeyed, however unwelcome they might be to him personally. He therefore summoned all the units in question to Paris, told them the news, and exhorted them to accept the inevitable, emphasizing the unprecedented opportunities and rich rewards that awaited them when victory was theirs. And in an effort to reconcile them to their fate, he promised that their families would be transported with them to the east at public expense. But the legionaries, their anger now further inflamed by the anonymous pamphlets that were being circulated from hand to hand,